Today I'll show you how much time I spent working in the garden over the last 7 days to give you a better idea of how much time it takes to maintain a 600 square foot garden using the methods I describe in my videos. With spring planting complete, there isn't that much work to do in the garden other than harvesting, ongoing maintenance, succession planting, and occasional watering. Today's video will show you exactly what I did in the garden over the last 7 days and how much time it took. But more importantly, it will highlight what I didn't have to do as a result of the methods I used. But I'll talk more about that later. Let's start with last Saturday. The total amount of time spent working in the garden will be displayed in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. Saturday I was very busy making last week's video and didn't have much time to work in the garden. So all I did was harvest some crops for dinner. I started with sugar snap peas, which we planted under a cold frame in early March and have been harvesting since early June. We've enjoyed one of our best sugar snap pea crops ever this year, but soon production will slow down quite a bit. To continue to make use of this bed and its trellises, I've already planted winter squash to climb the trellises after the pea plants have been removed. I also harvested a cauliflower plant that clearly isn't going to produce a head, but will still eat the leaves. We've never had much luck growing cauliflower, probably because of the limited sun in our garden. So on Saturday I spent less than 4 minutes working in the garden, if you can call it that. Now let's take a look at Sunday. Sunday was another busy day for me outside the garden, but I did have time to harvest a few things for dinner to add to a pasta dish. I harvested dinosaur kale, red vein sorrel, and garlic chives. The day's harvest took just under 2 minutes and brought the week total to 5 minutes and 51 seconds. I always try to keep a close eye on the extended weather forecast so I can better anticipate the needs of our garden. On Monday, I noticed there was a severe thunderstorm warning for Wednesday. Vertical crops can be especially sensitive to heavy rains, so I spent some time Monday evening securing all of our vertical crops. The sunchokes had grown quite a bit since I last tied them to the trellis with twine, so I looped more twine around them near the top and tied it to the trellis. I then moved on to the peas and used twine to pull some stragglers closer to the trellis, which will encourage them to latch onto the trellis with their tendrils. After tying off the peas, I moved on to the tomatoes. Though it's hard to see, I'm using garden tape to tie an indeterminate tomato plant to an EMT electrical conduit pipe, which is acting as a stake. Next, I secured tomatoes growing on this remesh trellis. There are 4 plants climbing the trellis, but I can only reach 2 of them from here. In addition to tying off the plants, I also pruned suckers, which is part of my weekly routine for tomatoes. All of the tomatoes are pruned to a single stem. I then moved on to secure more of the tomatoes growing on remesh trellises. Between the trellises and conduit stakes, we have over 30 tomato plants in the garden. Tying off and training our vertical crops is actually something I do almost every week during the summer, but I decided to do it earlier than expected this week because of the heavy rains in the forecast. The rest of this clip just shows me tying off and pruning tomatoes, so I'll let it play out without further commentary so we can see how long it took to complete the task. Okay, it took 14 minutes and 49 seconds to secure all of our vertical crops and prune tomato suckers, bringing my total work time for the week to 20 minutes and 20 seconds. With the vertical crops secured for Wednesday's storm, now I'll harvest some greens for dinner. I harvested the last of our romaine lettuce, which was starting to bolt, and some purple kale. We love to grow greens not only because they're so good for us, but also because they're very easy to grow in our shaded garden. Here's a look at the harvest. By the end of Monday, the 3rd day, I had spent a total of 22 minutes and 12 seconds working in the garden. By Tuesday, the weather forecast was looking much more ominous for the Chicago area and much of the Midwest. Severe thunderstorms, damaging winds, and large hail were expected on Wednesday, so I took additional precautions to protect at least some parts of the garden. In order to be ready to protect some plants from hail, I set a clear tote near our butternut squash, set up PVC hoops over carrots, beets, and parsnips, and partially covered our sweet potato cold frames with glass. And though I wasn't sure exactly how it would work out, I made an effort to create structures above a couple of our beds that we could cover with plastic in order to protect the beds from hail if the need arose. After finishing my storm prep, I harvested a variety of greens for dinner, including tree collards, dandelion greens, good King Henry, French sorrel, and turnip greens. On Tuesday, I worked a little over 7 minutes in the garden, bringing the total time up to 29 minutes and 18 seconds. Based on the hourly forecast on Wednesday morning, it looked like most of the severe weather would arrive in the evening, so I held off on taking additional precautions to protect the garden. When I returned to the garden later in the day to harvest for dinner, it had only rained a little bit all day and the weather was pleasant. But the forecast still warned of damaging winds and large hail, so I stayed alert that evening and was ready to spring into action if I needed to cover my makeshift shelters with plastic. After less than 3 minutes in the garden on Wednesday, the 5-day work total was up to 32 minutes and 9 seconds. I kept a very close eye on the weather on Wednesday evening just in case I needed to jump into action to protect the garden. Fortunately, the large hail and damaging winds never arrived. Instead, we just had a heavy thunderstorm, which actually helped the garden quite a bit. Early Thursday morning, I removed the covers from the winter squash and the cold frames. Later in the evening, I came back to remove the rest of the protective structures and to harvest crops for dinner. The garden looked great after the thunderstorm. After worrying about wind and hail damage, it was such a relief to see the garden looking even better than before. It took less than a minute to remove the clear tote and the glass covers. When I returned in the evening, I removed the last of the protective structures and then harvested potatoes and turnips for dinner. I planted Yukon Gold and Norland Red potatoes under cover in this compost bin in late March, and we started harvesting them early this month. After several meals of potatoes from this bin, this was our final harvest. We have a number of other potato crops that we succession planted this spring, so we should have a continuous harvest of potatoes through late summer. Purple Vikings will be harvested next, followed by Red Golds, Purple Majesties, Russets, and German Butterballs. After harvesting potatoes, I picked the last of our turnips and headed inside to make dinner. I spent less than 12 minutes working in the garden on Thursday, bringing the total for 6 days to 44 minutes and 51 seconds. Here's a look at the potato harvest. Finally, on Friday, the 7th day, I did a little bit of weeding and pest control, and also mulched some nearly bare soil with grass clippings. I started by adding grass clippings to areas of the garden where the mulch was getting thin. We don't have a lawn, but our neighbor does, and he gives us his grass clippings. I know he doesn't use pesticides, so I'm comfortable using his clippings in our garden. As I mulched, I found and pulled 5 weeds. Actually, only 2 of them were what you would normally think of as weeds. The other 3 were small volunteer tomato plants. We have so many food seeds in the soil that it's normal to find more volunteer crops growing than weeds. Mulch does such a great job of suppressing weeds that we usually only pull a handful at most each week. Next, I inspected our squash plants for squash bug eggs. Squash bugs are the one persistent pest in our garden that doesn't appear to have a predator, and this is the time of year that we usually start seeing their eggs. As expected, I found quite a few, and I used packing tape to remove the eggs from stems and leaves. I spent a little more than 12 minutes mulching, weeding, and removing squash bug eggs on Friday, bringing the final 7-day work total to only 57 minutes and 8 seconds. And here are the squash bug eggs I collected on the packing tape. If I continue to remove eggs once or twice each week, squash bugs shouldn't be much of a problem this year. So over the course of the week, I spent less than an hour working in the garden, which is fairly typical for this time of year when we're more in maintenance mode. But to better understand how I'm able to keep the work time down so low, I think it's important to look at things I didn't do. For example, I didn't water, I didn't spend hours weeding, and I didn't spray the garden with pesticides. Of course, part of the reason I didn't have to water this week is that we had a heavy thunderstorm, and in general we get a decent amount of rain here. But another reason we can sometimes go for weeks without watering is that we always try to keep the ground covered with mulch. Mulching is also responsible for the fact that weeding is never a big chore in our garden. I know people are sometimes skeptical when I talk about how few weeds we have in our garden, but the 15 seconds or so I spent pulling 5 weeds this week is fairly typical. Many weeks go by when I don't pull any. Thanks to mulching, there's simply not a problem for us. Finally, beneficial insects, including predators like ladybugs, are so important to the success of our low-effort garden that we don't use sprays that could potentially harm them. Instead, we manage pests by growing in polycultures and by removing them manually. This may seem time-consuming, but we actually spend very little time managing pests because predators take care of most of them for us. Besides, I'm happy to spend some of the time saved on weeding and watering to control pests in a way that doesn't harm beneficial organisms. I'm convinced that in the end, this results in much less work than if I inadvertently killed predators by spraying plants, even with organic controls. As I mentioned earlier, summer really isn't a very busy time in the garden, not nearly as busy as spring. So to give you a better idea of how much time we spend working in the garden throughout the year, I'll bring you a series of videos on this topic. One more for fall, one for winter, and one for spring. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe for more videos on how to grow a lot of food on a little land without spending too much or working harder than you really have to.